searching for a God to love. Is that the God we find in the Bible? Is that the God that is understood in society? With so much suffering around us, how can Christians actually say that God is love? Here to discuss those issues and perhaps give us some answers is author Chris Blake and Pastor Patrick Johnson. Chris, there is so much suffering in the world when I look around. How can you claim in your book, Searching for a God to Love, that God is love?
Yeah. Now, this has been bandied about for millennia. It's a huge, huge issue, a problem, and it's probably turned away more people from God than any other question. If God is good, then why does this happen? If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing, then why doesn't God stop what's going on? It's a mystery to some degree, and there are some ways to look at it, I think, that give some answers without being too shallow and too simple. I'm reminded of a time I had met with a friend, a Danish atheist named Christian, as it turns out. And Christian says, why doesn't your God stop suffering? Even a good parent on this planet will stop his children from hurting each other. Why doesn't your God? And so I said to Christian, what do you think causes the most pain on the planet? Is it words or weapons? And he thought for a moment. He said, probably words. The words that are spoken and the words that are not spoken cause immense suffering. And I said, so to control the suffering generated by words, God would have to control the ideas behind the words, to have thought control, whether we wanted it or not. There's a man named Adolf Hitler who wanted to do something like that. Would you like a God like that? And Christian's eyes got large. He said, I see what you mean. No, I would not.
But Patrick, one thing is what Chris is saying about suffering, that words are so powerful and how they make us suffer, and how ideas actually leads to immense world suffering. But we also know that suffering are very personal in people's lives. And how, do you see that as a pastor, that when people are struck with illness, when people are experiencing sadness in their lives, that they question God more?
Yeah, and I have a personal experience with this, having a son with a certain debilitating illness and disabilities. Suffering can either turn you towards God or away from God. That seems to be what happens. That's what I find in meeting people. In our case, if I think about my son, it's actually helped him to get closer to God in some way, because the hope that we talked about on a previous program, that became even stronger for him as he developed and gotten to know God. Whereas for others, suffering tends to say, well, if this good God is there, I don't want to know, because he should be taking this away from me. So it can go both ways. And there's no real telling which way a person will go when they experience suffering for themselves.
Yes.
So I don't think there's an automatic, if you suffer, you will reject God. I think it can go both ways.
But I also seem to recall through the church's history that there have been times when people say, well, you have to suffer. You have to suffer, otherwise you can't be a Christian.
Yes.
There's the whole martyrdom, and that, if we're not suffering, we're not experiencing the love of God. And how distorted or how realistic is that view of God?
Yeah. Well, I think of what happened after September 11th, 2001, and the World Trade Towers. It's said that after those tragedies, that airline safety got got better. But I'm not going to be thanking the terrorists for that airline safety, you know? I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my son, Patrick, when Jeffrey was 5 years old, and we were eating Cheerios together, breakfast cereal in the States. And he said he wanted to go see a friend, and I said, sorry, Jeff, you can't see him today. And Jeff thought about this, you know, and the 5-year-old philosophers, you know, thinking. And then he said, Dad, God doesn't always get his way either, does he? I remember my eyes misted over a little as I thought of this. I said, no, Jeff, he doesn't. You know, it's not God's will that people suffer in one sense. God is not willing that any should perish, it says in Philippians. And yet apparently people will perish outside of what God wants. Now, of course, we mentioned before that the closer we get to paradox, the closer we get to truth. It is true that God's will is done, and it's also true that God's will is to grant us freedom. And that freedom has led to all sorts of things which God would wish would not happen, you know. And so I'm reminded of when I bought a house. I bought the house so that it would be a center for my family to live and grow. With it, I also bought a life of virtual poverty because of the mortgage payments, you know. And the mortgage is owned by the bank. I say I own my house, but really the bank owns my house. Right now on this planet, the mortgage payments of freedom are suffering. And right now, the enemy owns the bank, the enemy we call the evil one, you know, the principalities of darkness. And what God says is, someday I will buy back the bank. Someday I will buy back the bank. But the mortgage payments now of the freedom that we enjoy are suffering.
Yes, you know, I'm really glad that the Bible actually starts out with God creating the world perfectly. I mean, He created it well. He didn't create it with suffering. He created it very good, it says. And, you know, He was very pleased with what He'd done. Everything was just harmonious and good. Inherent within what He had created was the freedom to choose. Because love has to do that, doesn't it? You can't force love. So, yes, there was the freedom to choose. And as you say, because of the choice, He had to allow our first parents, Adam and Eve then, to choose whichever way they wanted to. But I'm glad it starts out saying that God created a good world. If it had been inherently evil, if there was suffering right from the beginning, then you could start wondering, well, I'm not so sure about this God. But He did start it out well. Things went very wrong, and that's what we're living in the consequences of now, but it started it out good.
Patrick, you mentioned a little bit earlier that people get either drawn to God or get turned off by God when they encounter suffering. But I think there's also an element of fairness in suffering. Is life fair if I have to suffer? How can there be a fair God if I have to suffer? And why do babies die? You know, why do people, you know, I'm reminded of a funeral that you conducted at some time, Patrick, of a newborn perfect baby that died. And why? I mean, how can God allow that to happen? I can accept the philosophical argument of freedoms and being as a mortgage payment, but you know, when reality hits ground, why?
And that question has been asked, I think, many times. If I look at the Bible, I see there are several people in there that have asked that question in the midst of their suffering. One very good example is a guy named Job, who lost everything: children, house, all his possessions, everything. And he was asking why. fascinates me with the book, though, is that God comes and answers, but he doesn't answer the question why. Yes. Basically, what God does is he says, who's in control?
Yeah.
Can I, and he mentions all kinds of things. You know, can I create snow? What can I do? Yeah. And God, basically Job says, okay, you've got control. My situation isn't right now, but okay, I can trust you. And really that's the bottom line, because I've tried to think of answering the question why, and I can't come up with any good answers. The most comforting thing I can kind of come up with, well, is God in control despite what I'm seeing? And that's as far as I can get, really.
Yeah, two things come to my mind as you were talking. The first one is that life is not fair.
No, it isn't.
Life is not fair. And the other, the correlative is God, however, is not life. God is the author of life. God is behind life. God is the sustainer of life. But God is not this life. There are things that have gone wrong that are not God's doing, And God says, you're right, it's not fair. And I want you to help put it right. It's up to you to help put it right. The clearest demonstration of what God wants, of course, is in Jesus. And so what you have Jesus doing is meeting suffering and healing people and touching them over and over and healing them. This is the clearest evidence of what God wants when it comes to suffering, is God is a God of healing. Because as Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we'll just take a short break and we'll be back to continue this discussion.
The themes and topics explored in this series are from Chris Blake's book, Searching for a God to Love. For more information on how to get your copy, please visit searchingforagodtolove.org.uk.
I wanted to learn English.
I wanted to do ministry.
To have a church for the people of the streets, the wounded, the rejected.
To get both a theological perspective but also a psychological perspective of what human beings are.
I wanted a more theological base and a more steady base, and not just opinions or things that I think about the Bible, but to know more.
It's being opening like a new world.
Welcome back as we continue to talk about suffering, why so much. Now, Chris, I'm just going to read a little bit from your book here, and you put a question in here that I really like. And it's a columnist, Anne Landers, who writes a dialogue, and this is how it goes. She asks, sometimes I would like to ask God why he allows poverty, famine, and injustice when he could do something about it. Well, why don't you ask him? And her answer is, because I'm afraid God might ask me the same question.
Yeah.
Patrick, you mentioned earlier that you have experienced suffering on a personal level in your own family. And I think there is not a person walking this earth who haven't had some level of encountering with suffering or with pain. How do we live through that? How do you as a Christian continue to just deal with that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things is to be realistic about it, to actually embrace what it is that you're going through. All too often I meet Christians who will say, well, if you just pray about it, God will take it away. It doesn't happen.
No.
It does not happen. And it's not because I lack faith in God, I don't think. There are times, and it's even in the Bible, where God says, to one man named Paul, who had some form of problem, he prayed about it, and God says, I'm not going to heal you from this. Just walk with me through it. And there is that walking through whatever it is with God. there are times when it hurts more, and you cry out and you're questioning, but it's good to have something solid to bang against.
That's right.
And okay, maybe the answer won't be there, but at least being able to express what's going on, that there's a cleansing in that as well. There's that hope that we've talked about that you keep coming back to. So be realistic with whatever that suffering is. I think that's an important thing. In one sense, it can produce even a greater trust in God. I know that may sound somewhat weird, but it makes you just rely on Him even more, because you cry out to God more, and you perhaps drawn to God's heart a little bit more. Because I think He doesn't just look at what's going on here and think, oh, I'm glad I'm not doing that, I'm not going through that. I think He's feeling what we're feeling too.
Yes.
And so it kind of can draw you somewhat closer to God's heart going through suffering too. So I don't think there's any easy answer to it, but embracing it and walking through it and just taking one day at a time. That's
But don't
been
you get
part of it.
upset at God? Don't you get upset at God and ask, God, why are you putting me through this? I've had enough. I think I've had enough suffering. Give me a break.
Yes.
What do you do with that?
I don't think God's behind it all, is what helps me, very practically. For me, I see other agencies at work. I see people at work. I see cataclysmic randomness at work sometimes, And I understand God is there, but I also, and I keep coming back to this because it's so central, is the sacredness of freedom. I talked with a colleague of mine, and he said, I want God to stop all suffering. I don't care if He takes away all freedom. I can't go there. I cannot go there. Freedom means more to me than that. But on a practical level, dealing with suffering, two things come to mind and that help me to deal. One of them is the understanding that this too shall pass. This too shall pass. I can remember when I had the most intense pain of my life, passing a kidney stone. Literally, that too passed,
Thankfully.
Yes, thankfully, that's right. And I had to keep that in mind. And that was a realistic hope, yes, this too shall pass. The other one is, as the dialogue suggests, it helps me to deal with my suffering and to see what's around the world if I invest in helping to alleviate suffering in practical ways. I do it through helping people, and maybe giving money, giving time, in praying for people, in writing letters for Amnesty International. All of these ways are ways so that I can help to alleviate suffering, and it helps me feel that I'm not helpless. That feeling of helplessness, I think, is really debilitating. If we can feel like I'm doing something to help in this world of suffering, I also feel at that point I'm on God's side.
There's another thing as well, though.
Yeah.
And that is knowing that you're not alone with your pain.
Yes.
There is something about having somebody with you through your suffering that really does help. Any time a child has fallen over and hurt its knee, and the parent comes and holds the child, you aren't taking away the pain, because the pain is still there, right? That knee is still throbbing and it hurts, but there is a comfort in the fact that there's somebody holding me and I'm not alone in my suffering.
Yes.
And that is a really good source of comfort and strength too.
Yeah.
So either it's family members, hopefully a church family as well that can help. That's why we have support groups, so that people who understand what you're going through, the same kind of thing, that you're not on your own. And of course, right. You mentioned earlier where God says, I'll never leave you. There is this sense of God's holding me through this too.
Yeah.
Jesus has this one place where He says, you're in my Father's hand and nobody can take you out of my Father's hands.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So God's holding you through it. brings some form of help and comfort.
Yes, it does.
Walking through
and a
pain
very,
too.
very practical, palpable, tangible level comes to my mind. A little over a year ago, I was training for a team triathlon on my bicycle, and I fell very hard on concrete, and I broke my femur, and ended up, in excruciating pain. I had 3 5-inch screws in my leg right now. That night after the operation, I was just in, there are levels of pain, and you can have moaning pain, and you can also have whimpering pain. And I was in whimpering pain. I was just thrashing about in my hospital bed. And I remember it was one of those interminable nights. I thought I would never see the light of day. And I was thrashing. It was about 4 a.m, and just whimpering. And a nurse came in, and unbidden, I watched my hand go up like this, like I was a drowning man. And this nurse knew exactly what to do. She came to my bedside, she pulled down my sleeve, and she just rubbed my skin like this. And that feeling of human touch was a balm to my soul. It just brought me such comfort. I will never forget it. Human touch, as you pointed out, picking up a child. I had somebody come in and pray with me, and they grabbed my hand, and just the feel of that human touch, even if they hadn't said a word, that human touch, appropriate, comforting touch, is what's called for. And Jesus went around touching people all the time, all the time. He went out of his way to do that. Yeah.
And Patrick, you mentioned earlier that hopefully sometimes that holding you and walking with you through pain, or rubbing your arm as you needed to be done in hospital, that human touch, hopefully we can experience that from our church family. However, it's often, I find that when we talk about suffering, there seems to be a large amount of Christians who says, well, this is because you have sinned. This is a result of your sin or your lack of faith. And that just throws me off balance in many ways. How can I believe in a loving God who sends me suffering to punish me?
And I think it's to do with a misunderstood meaning of illness and suffering. So many people think that suffering comes to those who deserve it. But it, as you said, in this world, life isn't fair, and suffering comes unbidden to all people, and you don't have to have deserved it in any way. It's very random in that sense. I think of examples in the Bible where Jesus' disciples say, so who sinned? Was it this man's parents, or was it him? Why he's suffering? And Jesus says, no, it's not that at all. God's glory can be showed in this guy's life. If we have this idea that the meaning of your suffering is because you've sinned, then we're on a wrong track, I think, because it does just come.
So you're saying it's not because of something I have done?
No, not at all. No. There are consequences to what we do, without a doubt. If I don't look after myself, from what science tells us today, if I eat wrong, I can get all kinds of heart conditions and things like that. There are those consequences, yes. Sure. But you can't always say that there is a direct link between what I've done and what I'm suffering. No.
So you're then also saying, that sounds a little bit easy in many ways. Are we just, not giving God the blame for our suffering? Are we just moving away from that? But what about, I have prayed, and you talked about that in the beginning of the program. I pray and I pray for God to remove this suffering from me. Is my faith not strong enough? Because if faith should be able to move mountain, surely I could have faith enough to pray myself well by the grace of God.
Yes. Well, that's why I'm really glad that that's in the Bible there, because, you know, as I said, this man Paul, he prayed 3 times about whatever thing it was that was bothering him. And the answer he got from God was, no, you're going to have this. You're going to have to suffer with this all your life. My grace will be sufficient to bring you through this. So it had nothing to do with his faith. God says, well, this one you've got to carry. Now you could say, now why? I'm not too sure, but you know, there are times when you don't get healed, where the suffering isn't taken away, where you got to walk through it. And
the example I think of someone who prayed for something to be taken away is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. 3 times he prays, take this away, take this away. Now, if you've ever asked for anything 3 times, you know, he really didn't want to go through it. He didn't want to be separated from the Father. And he asked 3 times, and then at the end he says, nevertheless, thy will be done. And that nevertheless, that one word is what saves us. But you see Jesus, who is not wanting, you know, he's not embracing, in one sense, he's not embracing the suffering. In another sense, he is. Again, the paradox. In another sense, he says, all right. What helps me a great deal, you know, and in understanding God's role in suffering is to see Jesus on the cross. I look, when I'm at the foot of the cross and looking up at Jesus, I understand more about God's view of suffering, because when Jesus is up there, you know, moaning and twitching, calling out, that's the Son of God. And I understand that God knows suffering, that God has been through it, that God understands that we are not abandoned. We are not abandoned. And when I understand that and see all that, it helps me to get through, and that realistic hope again takes over.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Patrick, for sharing on this very difficult topic. And thank you for watching. If you want to know more, why don't you visit us on our website, www.searchingforagodtolove.org.uk. Thank you.